So what I'm actually going to talk about, I hope, will provide kind of some bridges between many of the things that we have been talking about today, in that I am going to talk about seed dispersal. The organisers asked that we touch on that, and I'll look at the application of some of these more mechanistic models of seed dispersal that Ran has been good enough to give us an introduction to in some of the pattern forming models that Max was talking about this morning. But I thought that in doing that I should provide some background and maybe even step us a little bit more slowly through the idea behind some of these mechanistic models for seed dispersal. And one of the nice things about this, I think, is it might get at one of the points that John raised earlier this morning in terms of some of the strategies that we can attempt to use to relate processes that have fundamentally different timescales. So we'll try to do all of that. I think it's now 5 a.m. in California, so if we're very lucky, I might also wake up at some point during this talk. So the background to all of this, as we've been hearing a lot about today, is that when we do look at the dryland ecosystems that this workshop is addressing, one of the ubiquitous features is a pronounced spatial structure. I did want to get in a photograph of California, and this is a slightly odd fish to look at. I noticed these while driving around the bottom end of the Central Valley the other day. Very, very, very linear features and upperennial vegetation, but here probably produced by faulting around the San Andreas Fault and the vegetation lines following different stratigraphy. At any rate, even if we ignore those very linear features, we do have this pronounced spatial structure. We've heard many people today making the argument that that spatial structure is relevant for understanding the resilience and the productivity of these systems, and therefore many of the goal functions that we're looking to resolve here are models that can help us understand the drivers of this structure. So I would argue that if we are going to understand spatial structure from a dynamical point of view, as opposed to simply resolving a steady state condition, then it's critical that the models that we use to do that have a realistic, or at least reasonable, representation of the dynamics of movement of the population that we are interested in. And despite the photograph of the cow, this is not a cow being mobbed by flies, but rather a cow covered in seeds. While we are thinking about vegetation populations, then the form of movement that we need to focus upon is seed dispersal itself. Before we get into the specifics of seed dispersal, I wanted to walk through the Fisher-Kolmogorov equation, and to steal a term from Gabby, this is Darcy's law, but for movement ecology. And I guess a little bit differently than I think some of the models Ran was talking about, this is a continuous approach to simulating the distribution of biomass, and in fact was originally proposed as part of the eugenics movement, believe it or not, in the 1930s, as a way of trying to understand how genes might move through populations. So from that rather ignominious beginning, what we're looking at here is an equation that describes the rate of change of some representation of the population, and mostly here I'll be talking about the biomass density expressed as a mass per area. The rate of change of that expressed as a function of the local growth processes. Here I've written up an equation for logistic growth in its fairly standard form, but of course you can take this growth process at a point and replace it with your favourite model, representing the carrying capacity limitations as a function of resources, bringing in other dynamics, etc. All of the stuff that you want to represent in terms of the time evolution of a population of biomass at that point. And then for spatial spread, what we typically see in this Fisher-Kolmogorov equation is that spatial spread being represented as diffusion. So that's a dependence upon the gradient of the local biomass multiplied by some coefficient to represent the rate at which motion occurs. Given the Fisher-Kolmogorov equation, one of the nice mathematical properties that comes out of this is that, at least for the case of spatially homogeneous conditions, the spread that comes out of this is isotropic and it has a constant behaviour. So, in fact, the solution for this model, assuming that we start with a concentrated region of biomass at a point, is that that region simply expands through space as a propagating wave, and that wave moves with a constant celerity once it reaches its asymptotic limit. That is purely a function of the rate of growth. That was trying to come out as rate of growth. The growth rate of the population and that diffusion coefficient itself. So we have this dynamical behaviour for this simple system that's really very strongly constrained by two of the parameters in the model. what I'd now like to do is critique this particular approach. One of the commonly articulated problems with using this sort of diffusive-based approach is that we're starting to pretend that plants like to diffuse through ecosystems. So this is sometimes called the green goo approximation. Rather than dealing with individual organisms, rather than dealing with biological processes, we've just got some sort of green surface that's behaving as if it is diffusing. Now, of course, what is diffusion, and why might this be problematic? Diffusion, as I suspect most folks in the room are familiar with, is a macroscopic limit of a microscopic process, where that microscopic process would be represented by a random walk being taken by individuals. And if we take that random walk and say we now have a population of individuals that's doing it, and we assume that the typical step taken in that random walk is drawn from a normal or Gaussian distribution, so behaves quote-unquote normally, then if we average over the entire behaviour of the population, the result that comes out is described by a diffusion equation. One of the issues with this, when we start to think specifically about seed dispersal, is that assumption of the individual steps coming from a normal distribution, because seed dispersal can really generate some very non-local behaviour. And again, I think Ron's given us a nice introduction to this in the sense that we can have people moving organisms around, we can have very large wind events moving organisms around, and all of this means that if we do look at the behaviour of the individual moving particles, diffusion may be an inappropriate analogy because it does not account for those long jumps. Perhaps more problematically, at least in the case of thinking about arid ecosystems and dispersal, the diffusive representation that's given, at least in the Fisher-Kolmogorov equation, suggests that the flux of biomass, represented by moving seeds, depends upon a gradient given by the entirety of the local biomass. So to put this in slightly more realistic terms, what this effectively suggests is that this tree sitting out here in an open field, where we have a very strong local biomass gradient, should somehow be necessarily producing more seeds, spreading them around more effectively, than trees that were growing as part of a forest, even if those trees are essentially experiencing the same ecological conditions. And despite perhaps some arguments that we could make about the behaviour of wind near edges and around individual trees, I don't think this is a particularly reasonable hypothesis. There's no fundamental reason that we should see different fecundity and different spread processes arising as a function of the total local biomass. So together, these things suggest that we perhaps could do a little bit better in terms of mathematical ways to describe the motion of seeds. And in order to do this, we need to start asking ourselves some hard questions, namely, how do seeds move? So if you're ever looking for a part of biology where evolution tends to make things run completely amok, the reproductive biology is a really good place to do that, because of course, when we start to think about the processes that evolution acts on, it is indeed those that are to do with reproduction. So let's take a little look at some of the taxonomies of seed dispersal that we could see. And in order to get into that, let's also talk about words, because we're going to be seeing this particular suffix "cory" an awful lot. And anytime you see a word that ends in "cory," it's referring to a different mechanism of seed dispersal. So we can start thinking about seed dispersal as occurring in three very different ways. We've talked a little bit already about the propensity for long-distance dispersal, which you'll see called telechory. We can also envisage some plants that don't have particular adaptations to promote long-distance dispersal and could be said to display, therefore, atelechory. And we can even go to the opposite extreme and find plants that have adaptations that explicitly appear to exist to prevent long-distance dispersal, and these adaptations are referred to as anti-telechory. This is like reading the dictionary, so apologies for all of that. If we start to dig deeper into some of the mechanisms that can lead to these different kinds of cories, then some of the things that we'll start to see when we look at long-distance dispersal include zoochory, so movement of seeds by animals. That can happen both, of course, within and on the exterior of an animal. Ran's talked a little bit already about anemomechory, so the movement of seed by wind. And perhaps not as well studied outside of wetlands and rivers is another mechanism of hydrochory, so the movement of seed by water, which could also lead potentially to long-distance dispersal. If we start to look at anti-telechory, a couple of examples that come to mind are geochory, so this is where plants develop a fruiting body, cunningly plant it within the ground, and ensure that their seeds, therefore, are located only as far as their branch could reach. We also see examples of barrow quarry. So if we have an incredibly heavy seed, then we come back to these ballistic models of stuff that's just falling under gravity. And perhaps somewhere in the middle, examples say like autocory, this might be shattering, or the existence of maybe elastic mechanisms in plants to locally project their seeds. This certainly gets seeds away from the parent, but doesn't do a good job of getting them a long distance away. And maybe a subset of zoocory, myrmecocory, or dispersal by ants. Ants can certainly move seeds long distances, but then they tend to bury them within their nests, so they don't really undergo very long distance dispersal. Poof. All right, that's a lot of mechanisms. There's a lot of complexity and a lot of richness in this problem. So when we start to look at drylands specifically, we do find, and this is true of almost any ecosystem, that most of these sorts of mechanisms will occur one way or another. Although in drylands we particularly tend to have a propensity towards the atelocory or the antitelocory. Drylands are not the ecosystems in which we really tend to see very long distance dispersal being the predominant mechanism of seed dispersal. So what we're looking for now is a generic representation of most of these kinds of mechanisms that we can implement into a simple framework such as the Fisher-Kolmogorov equation. And I should say that mechanistically what I'm about to present is probably good for most things with the exception of animal-mediated dispersal, because in order to deal with that we really need to have a movement ecology model that respects the behaviour of animals, and that's a whole separate problem. So we can do this in a way that I think addresses the two major criticisms that I made of the Fisher-Kolmogorov equation before, with a fairly simple modification to that equation that now represents it as an Integro-differential form of that equation rather than the diffusion equation form. What we're doing here is separating the biomass that's present in any cell, or our biomass density in any cell, into essentially an immobile component that represents the fixed biomass that isn't moving around in space, and a mobile component which is going to do the motion. Our immobile component continues to do logistic growth, and all of the spread is now occurring only within the mobile component of the biomass, which we're taking to represent the seeds. The spread here is given simply as a convolution integral between the mobile biomass, so that's the product of this fecundity and the standing biomass at the point there, and a dispersal kernel, where the dispersal kernel is a probability function that's representing the distribution of distances that individual seeds can travel from their parent. Now, this is where we get into some of the scaling over processes with different timescale problems, because of course the process we're talking about in this equation, which is the evolution of a population, is very slow by comparison to the motion of individual seeds. And in representing that motion of individual seeds in terms of a dispersal kernel, which again, as Ran was describing, can be derived directly from the interactions of, at least in the case of wind dispersal, the interaction of the moving wind, the fluid mechanics of the air around the inertial particle of a seed, we can respect those fast timescale processes and represent only their net effect in terms of movement. So if we wanted to reproduce a purely diffusive approach to this, we could take that dispersal kernel, pop in a Gaussian function, and we would be back to a regular random walk. But what we've tended to do in exploring this further is use the world model that, again, we had an introduction to, in part because we do have a physical rationale for why that model should emerge, and in part because it gives us tremendous flexibility. This is a model that can be parameterized such that we do get, maybe over at least one decade, some power law behaviour, but can also be parameterised in such a way that we really have very local dispersal only. So it's a way of representing seed motion that is very flexible for multiple purposes and multiple kinds of mechanisms. So what we've done is take that approach of representing biomass motion not as diffusion but as the convolution of a mobile fraction of biomass with an appropriate dispersal kernel and apply it specifically to the model of pattern vegetation that came from Max Rietkirch's group in the early 2000s. And we've been using this as a way to explore what some of the consequences of these different modes of plant motion might be for the predictions that these kinds of models can make. One of the very obvious things that comes out, and I think it was pretty obvious from all of the talks that we saw this morning that when we solve one of these systems of equations using diffusion as the major mechanism to provide motion, we end up with models that, yes, reproduce the gross features of the morphology of these vegetation patterns, but clearly do so in a very idealised way. We see very, very smooth responses by comparison to the much rougher and perhaps more irregular sorts of patterning that appear in the landscape. And in fact, this is one of the first obvious things that starts to fall apart once we remove diffusion and replace it with these Integro-differential equations, is that instead of having these sort of squiggly solutions, we start to see rather rougher solutions that are preserving a wider range of length scales in the final solution, and when we start to make some comparisons through spectral measures, maybe do a bit of a better job of representing the full power spectra of the vegetation that we observe. So the features that I think show up well in an image like this are disorder, multiple length scales, but also very sharp gradients in the biomass. If we zoom into any of these diffusive solutions and we look specifically at the transition from a patch to a bare soil condition, we're going to see a very smooth, gradual decline in the local biomass, which is a direct outcome of what the steady state should look like in a diffusive case. If we zoom in by comparison to one of these Integro-differential cases, we'll see very rapid and very sharp transitions in the local biomass because those are now stable once we remove that sensitivity to the local gradient. I think some rather... I have failed to put in a useful result here, so I'm going to describe it verbally and I hope it will make sense. One of the other key things that comes out with taking this Integro-differential approach to movement and applying it to a model that has bistability is that we start to see a real difference in the behaviour of the basins of attraction. If we start out with a model based on diffusion with no biomass and we sprinkle some biomass throughout it, as Max showed in his simulations this morning, that model evolves and eventually reaches the pattern steady state. What we're finding in these simulations is that we cannot reach the pattern steady state by taking a biomass devoid condition and sprinkling in a small amount of biomass, even if those perturbations locally are very large. What happens in those cases is that we have expanding fronts, we grow some large patches of biomass, and then the thing gets stuck. And it gets stuck in a disordered condition that it cannot self-organise from. If we take the same set of model parameters, by contrast, and we start our initial conditions as a fully vegetated state with some noise sprinkled into it, we can observe the collapse of that state into the pattern situation. So one of the implications here is that potentially we have some very significant history dependence in these systems if in fact these mechanisms of biomass spread are appropriate in these models. And that was the motivation for making this little reference to a paper by Manner and Schnerb, who found a very similar result when working with a more discrete agent-based model of systems in drylands, where as they started to turn down the diffusion, this actually was a diffusive-based model, and as they started to reduce the diffusion coefficient in this model to a very low condition, they found the same sort of behaviour of fronts that would expand and would ultimately be pinned, a condition that they referred to as the dynamic failure of Turing patterns. So what this suggests is that there are two kinds of dynamics that start to occur as we remove this sensitivity to the gradient and as we reduce this rate of motion that comes about by saying, look, there's really only a fraction of the biomass that is here moving. One of these is that we do see potentially this jamming and this pinning of these fronts of expanding biomass, in part because we no longer have the ability to use the local gradient as a basis for motion that can allow further self-organisation. The other thing that we start to see in these results is that multiple length scales become stable. And this, I think, based on looking at the dispersion relation for a model that's driven by the Integro-difference equation rather than being driven by a diffusion equation, is that we start to see multiple spatial length scales that all become unstable at about the same set of conditions. So these models seem to permit a wider range of unstable length scales to lead to the formation of the pattern and the instability. As we think more explicitly about seed dispersal, maybe we can start thinking about some other aspects of these systems. We'll see if these movies work. So this is just a simulation coming directly, Yes, that should look rather familiar, Max. It's a simulation that's coming directly from integration of the model that Rico's group produced. And of course, one of the very obvious features here is that we've got bands that are migrating upslope at a rate of knots. And as we start exploring the parameter space of these models, they go to sleep. As we start exploring the parameter state of these models, I can't make that come back, it's not really possible in these models to easily get to a condition where that rate of motion is small enough to correspond with observation. This is really a very, very rapid motion. It's unrealistically high. As we started thinking about seed dispersal, and particularly thinking about the potential interaction of seeds with overland flow, with patchy ecosystems, you immediately ask yourself the question, well, what is actually moving these seeds? And is it possible that we could be having downslope motion of these seeds and trapping of these seeds in vegetation bands? And that's something that can really be very easily explored with these models by simply putting a bias into the motion of the seeds. And let me show you what happens as we allow for downslope motion of the biomass. And this can either be done through taking the dispersal kernel approach and making that anisotropic, so it's more weighted towards a downslope condition, or by simply adding a downslope flux to the biomass in a more phenomenological sense. And this very rapidly gives rise to a condition in which these patterns stabilise. There are other mechanisms that could certainly lead to band stabilisation, but this does suggest that there might be other features associated with the biomass movement that could explain some of the discrepancies that we do see between models and reality. So, having moved to California, I wanted just to wrap up with a few questions about this. One of the difficulties with working with banded systems and working in very arid sites is that we're working with systems that are somewhere near their steady state. They may be perturbed around it, but they're not a million miles away from that steady state. And they're often very long-lived plants that respond, if at all, on the order of decades to changes in their environment. So it's not really an optimal situation for us to explore these kinds of physical models of the biomass motion. However, in California at the moment, we are witnessing, in fact, woody shrub encroachment associated largely with this species here, coyote brush. Believe it or not, this is an Asteraceae. I know it doesn't look an awful lot like a daisy, but there we go. This guy is expanding very rapidly throughout the southwest US, mostly in response to the abandonment of grazing land and reduction in fire frequency. It's an early successional species. I'm not going to say it does anything bad in terms of land degradation. I really don't think it necessarily does, and in fact probably acts as a nursery plant for other species. But it is an interesting plant to start thinking about. It's wind dispersed, so we have the opportunity to use the body of theory that we've been working with to explore it explicitly. And it has a few other finicky behaviours, namely that it's extremely sensitive to the local soil moisture conditions when it's trying to establish. And this, I think, might add some other interesting layers to asking about the dynamics of establishment, because now we're not merely looking at how do the seeds move around, but we need to start asking the question, well, what are the conditions that we need for establishment? How does that play into local climatic variability? I don't know if anyone remembers the map that was shown earlier of the coefficient of variation of rainfall, but California stands out as a bright red dot there. It's an extremely variable place rainfall-wise from year to year. And in order to really start to see how this plant establishes and to reconstruct its history, it's not going to be a case of continuous spread, but rather a form of spread that's very strongly mediated by extreme events. Yes, this is good. We're wrapping up. So this is just a series of photos pinched from Google Earth for a field site that we're working at in California, where grazing was removed right about the time this photo was taken in 1990. We're looking, believe it or not, down a very, very shallow gradient stream valley. And as we move through time, oh, you can't see a darn thing. We can see something there. Okay, so from a condition when we removed grazing to about 10 years later, we can start to see very rapid establishment of this Baccharis species, which increases a little through time and then appears to be rather static at the moment. We've had a run of very dry years. To really understand this, we need to start factoring in the landscape position, the physiology of the plant, the variability of the climate, and our movement ecology. This makes this a rich problem, but one that I think is becoming increasingly tractable. So that's a potential direction for taking this stuff further forward. And I think I am just about done. So I'd like to acknowledge some funding sources, two good friends in the room, and Simon Levin, who's not here right now. I'm not sure why I'm acknowledging Ignacio and Simon, because I haven't actually talked about the work we did together, but I think this might be an old acknowledgement slide. Thanks, folks.
We do have time for a couple of questions. Yeah.
Sally, that was a beautiful talk. But where you ended was, in fact, where my question takes off, and it refers, where you brought the landscape back into the problem. And it seems to me that in all of the things we've heard, and yours was a specific example of it, we have these models out there, these ideas of how things work. And yet, in order to test them against the world, we're faced with layers of complexity that most of these models don't entertain. Can you imagine a scenario where you could actually test let's say your integrative model? I mean, it almost needs like a petri dish of agar, of some uniform substrate, to really, give you the opportunity to test it. How do we do it? How do we test any of these models?
I don't know that I have a perfect answer to that. We can do better than we have been doing. I think, for instance, Anna and I were just having a chat about this in the context of seed dispersal. We're now really at the point where, for instance, we can start to monitor what's going on at the plant level in much greater detail than we historically have. Seed trapping is still going to be our major limitation there. We are now starting to see, I know coming out of Gabby's group, some better work in terms of representing the behaviour of the wind in slightly more complex terrain, so that can bring us a little bit out of our flatland landscapes. And I think a big part of what Ignacio was talking about, and in fact I know what Shimon is thinking about, relates to taking eco-hydrology from the point scale to the watershed scale. So I think we're seeing the theoretical developments that move in that direction. So two other things. One is models that have parameters that are physically meaningful is a major limitation. We've been doing a lot of work with toy models, a lot of work with phenomenological models. They tell us a lot about dynamics. They're bloody hard to test because what's competition? I've got a little alpha there, and how do I measure that? The parameterization of these toy models is a really non-trivial challenge. And then I think the final thing I will reiterate, because it's been said many times today, but it does bear repeating, particularly if we're thinking about, say, pattern systems, we've only got 3 kinds of shapes that will tessellate in a flat surface. So I guess what hydrologists would call the equifinality problem is a really non-trivial and very real problem when we're trying to use spatial morphology as an indicator. And the only way to do this is by fusing experiments and observations. So that was a total evasion of your question. I'm sorry. It's hard.
Sally, very nice talk. Question about your underlying model in the kernel. You're using a Gaussian model, basically. Why not just something like continuous time random walk or something that allows for this extreme event that Ron showed earlier?
So in fact, the world model that we're using is based on a random walk which is forced by the behaviour of turbulence. So the question that was asked in order to put this kernel together was to say, all right, I've got seeds, they're being blown by the wind. If I ignore turbulence, those guys are just going to fall ballistically, and all of the variability I see is only the variability that's inherent in the horizontal wind speed. By the time I add turbulence in, I now need to account for variations in the vertical wind speed as well, which is going to give me the potential for seeds to start moving up, experiencing yet higher wind speeds and really taking long jumps. So the world model comes as the macroscopic solution of that kind of a random walk. But I think I may have completely misunderstood your question.
Yeah, I think so. You have levy motion, you have jumps that are very, very long jumps that may have certain probability, and there are other tools, I know, from fractional representation to other representations. And I don't think it shows up in this, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know very well the inner working of this, but I just looked at the kernel. It looks completely Gaussian.
Well, what we were looking at was, this is not a true power law tail. This is a truncated power law tail. So we have the power law behaviour, but it is exponentially cut off. Yes, you can derive very similar sorts of results by using fractional calculus. I think I would still point to the fact that if you use fractional calculus and you apply that to the entire local biomass, what you're pretending is that the agent that's doing the movement is the plant as opposed to the seed. So I think this partitioning of the motion or of the biomass into a mobile and an immobile fraction is probably necessary in order to get local behaviour looking sensible. But in terms of the actual Integro-differential equation, I'm just lazy about solving fractional calculus equations, and this to me is more intuitive.
Ran?
Just a comment about that. It now has been shown that bias-correlated random walks can reproduce Levy walks quite well, and you can seldom or very hardly distinguish between these patterns. So what is the tail and what generates the tail? I think it's really a big question. Sally, thanks for the wonderful talk. I have two questions. One is that I was not sure if you distinguish between exponentially bounded kernels and fat-tailed kernels in the pattern formation.
We couldn't see, okay, so what we worked on, we just used the world, but we did look at different length scales in the world. So we looked at a case where we had only local dispersal, so things were locally exponentially truncated, and we looked at a case with a much lighter seed and therefore some of the power law behaviour. In these systems, this makes very little difference. And I think this speaks to the fact that when we are in arid environments, what's probably controlling the ultimate behaviour of the population is the survival once the seed lands. And that's very strongly spatially controlled by the distribution of water, which is very strongly spatially controlled by the distribution of biomass. So the second I've got a kernel that gets my seed to the next band, it really doesn't matter anymore. Now it's just a matter of sort of fiddling the proportion of those seeds that land in a nice spot. It was not very sensitive at all.
Is that working? Yeah. So my second question is that I don't know, but I have a feeling that these strong patterns are quite more abundant in arid or semi-arid environments than elsewhere. And maybe you have shown us those multiple modes of dispersal, and there were many names out there, but those cases are very rare in the plant world, very rare. Most of them, all these antitelechori and geocarpi and so on, and they are overrepresented in arid ecosystems. And actually, the title of the Elner and Schmida paper is why long range is so. Is not common in is that here somewhere?
Yeah, that's reference 2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So are you actually suggesting that this adaptation against long distance dispersal are generating this structural structures?
So there's a very interesting question around that, and I don't think we have, well, I don't have, in the room maybe we do. If we start to look at pattern vegetation explicitly and we break this down to the species level, and then you say, okay, what are the modes of dispersal that I see? It's really very common when we have vegetation that is forming regular spatial patterns that there's one or two dominant species that are associated with the pattern formation, but those are not the entirety of the species that are present in the ecosystem. So a good example of this, if we look at pattern vegetation in the United States, is that mesquite is commonly around, but generally does not participate in the pattern formation. It's behaving in some completely different fashion. Interestingly, if we start looking at some of those coexisting species, a lot of those guys tend to be animal dispersed rather than locally dispersed. So I'm suspicious that there might be a link. Certainly we know if we go back to a diffusive representation that there's a finite range of diffusion coefficients that we can analyse in a typical Turing fashion that will allow pattern formation to occur, and very long distance dispersal is not really conducive to pattern formation. We start to have our length scale of competition, to put it in those terms, becoming too large. I think it's plausible. I don't think we know.
Unfortunately, we are 20 minutes after schedule already, so I'm going to stop the conversation. I apologize. Maybe at the break you can catch up with Sally. It's 10 to 4. I recommend that we come back 10 minutes after, so for a 20 minutes break instead.